From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It's not just renewable energy, it's efficiency, and then it's also local foods and the next economy. I didn't really like this economy too much, didn't work out too well for my people. So the next economy has to be something that reaffirms our relationship to the earth and gives us a shot.
As UN climate talks in Katowice, Poland move into their second week, and the UN Secretary General warns climate change is a matter of life and death, we speak with Native American climate activist Winona LaDuke about an indigenous Green New Deal and more. Then to the rise of the right throughout Europe as Spain's Vox Party makes gains, we speak with former Greek finance minister, economist Yanis Varoufakis.
Spain does not have a far-right neo-fascist movement, unlike Italy, unlike France, unlike Germany. Well, now, out of the blue, in Andalusia, of all places, the stronghold of the Socialist Party, suddenly Vox, a rather nasty piece of work that emerged in 2014, suddenly came from nowhere to repeat the triumphs of the fascists in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, and so on and so forth.
Yanis Varoufakis is teaming up with Senator Bernie Sanders and others to fight right-wing forces around the globe. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The World Food Programme says parts of Yemen have entered into famine, with 73,000 Yemeni civilians facing starvation as the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition has cut supply lines and decimated Yemen's medical and sanitation infrastructure. The famine declaration comes as half of Yemen's 28 million people remain on the brink of starvation. This is David Beasley, director of the World Food Programme.
This report is devastating. It realizes our worst fears, that people are starving to death in Yemen. They need our help, and we're on the ground doing everything we can.
The stark warning came as representatives of the Houthi rebel movement met in Sweden for UN-brokered talks with members of Yemen's Saudi-backed government. It's just the second time since the conflict began in 2015 warring parties have met to discuss a political solution to the crisis in Yemen. The talks came as the U.S. Senate's preparing to debate a measure that would restrict U.S. support for the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen. In North Carolina, Democratic candidate Dan McCready has withdrawn his concession in a North Carolina congressional race where evidence is mounting Republicans stole the election by tampering with absentee ballots.
Over the last week, we have seen the criminal activity come to light, and we have seen that my opponent, Mark Harris, has bankrolled this criminal activity. And so as of today, I am withdrawing my concession to Mark Harris. And furthermore, I call on Mark Harris to tell the American people exactly what he knew and when he knew it.
A criminal investigation has already been launched, and calls are growing for a new vote to take place. The investigation centers on the actions of Republican operative Leslie McCrae Dowless, who ran an operation to illegally collect absentee ballots. Democrats fear Dowless collected Democratic ballots and then threw them away or filled out incompleted ballots to vote for the Republican candidate, Mark Harris. On Thursday, Harris filed campaign finance documents showing he spent more than $34,000 for something called reimbursement payment for Bladen absentee early voting poll workers, reimbursement door-to-door, unquote. Bladen County is where the absentee ballot effort took place. And it looks like the scandal is spreading to a second county in North Carolina. The United States and Canada are continuing to refuse to say why a top Chinese executive was arrested over the weekend during a stopover in Vancouver, Canada. Meng Wanzhou is the chief financial officer of the telecommunications giant Huawei and the daughter of the company's founder. Huawei recently surpassed Apple as the world's second largest smartphone maker. She has been held in Canada since Saturday, waiting for extradition to the United States. China condemned Washington for its, quote, hooliganism and despicable rogues approach, unquote. Meng's detention came on the same day President Trump met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Argentina to discuss the growing U.S.-China trade war. Huawei has been accused of violating U.S. sanctions against Iran and North Korea, but it's unclear if that's why Meng is being held. She'll appear in a Vancouver courtroom today for a bail hearing. A new report finds Greenland's ice sheet is melting at the fastest rate in centuries as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from human activity continue to increase to historic highs. Writing in the journal Nature, a team of international researchers warns that not only is Greenland's melt beginning to add to global sea level rise, but the rate of the melt is accelerating. This comes as the Trump administration moved to roll back an Obama-era conservation plan to protect a bird known as the sage grouse, which is close to endangered status. The rollback could open some 9 million acres of land in western states to new oil and gas drilling. In immigration news, BuzzFeed News reports an unknown imposter stole the online identity of a prominent Honduran activist in order to organize the migrant caravan that became a central issue for President Trump and the Republicans in the U.S. midterm elections. The activist, Bartolo Fuentes, says he hasn't gotten any answers from Facebook about who stole his identity or how many messages were sent by the imposter account. But Fuentes' identity was apparently central to a sophisticated campaign that organized the largest migrant caravan in history and some 7,000 Central Americans participating at its peak. President Trump blasted the caravan as a horde of invaders and used the issue as a wedge to drum up support for Republican candidates. And Vice President Mike Pence used the caravan to lash out at Venezuela and, quote, leftist groups.
What the president of Honduras told me is that the caravan was organized by leftist organizations, political activists within Honduras, and he said it was being funded by outside groups and even from Venezuela. And so the American people, I think see through this. They understand this is not a spontaneous caravan of vulnerable people, but it was organized by human traffickers and leftist groups.
Vice President Pence was speaking on Fox News. This comes as Facebook is under fire for failing to prevent Russia and other foreign governments from operating phony accounts to sway the U.S. electorate. Today is expected to be a big day in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia probe as he faces 2 deadlines. Mueller is expected to file paperwork detailing how Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, violated his plea agreement after he pleaded guilty to several federal charges and agreed to cooperate with investigators. In addition, Mueller is expected to submit a sentencing memo for former Trump attorney Michael Cohen. Last week, Cohen pleaded guilty to lying to Congress about Trump's efforts to build a skyscraper in Moscow while running for president. In August, Cohen pleaded guilty to 8 criminal charges, including tax evasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations. Meanwhile, former FBI Director James Comey is expected to testify today behind closed doors before the House Judiciary Committee. President Trump will nominate former television personality Heather Nauert as United States ambassador to the United Nations to replace outgoing Ambassador Nikki Haley. If confirmed by the Senate, Nauert will become one of the least experienced U.S. ambassadors to the UN in history. Before she joined the Trump administration as State Department spokesperson, Nauert worked as a news presenter on Fox and Friends. President Trump's reportedly considering William Barr as his leading candidate for U.S. Attorney General. Barr previously served as Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush in the early 90s. Barr has expressed sympathy for President Trump's demand that Hillary Clinton be prosecuted over her use of a private email server. An investigation by Mother Jones and The Trace reveals the Trump campaign and the National Rifle Association appear to have coordinated TV ads during the 2016 presidential race in violation of federal campaign finance law. Documents show the NRA and Trump both used the conservative PR firm National Media Research Planning and Placement to place the ads, and that same executive at the company authorized all the ads. Former federal election commissioner Ann Ravel said, quote, "I don't think I've ever seen a situation where illegal coordination seems more obvious." France is gearing up for more mass protests this weekend as the political movement known as the Yellow Vests continues to draw popular support across France. The protests began as a revolt against President Emmanuel Macron's tax hikes on fossil fuels. Macron has since delayed the fuel tax, but protesters are now pressing more than 40 other demands, including a minimum pension, a reduction in the retirement age, and tax reforms. During Yellow Vest protests last weekend, 400 people were arrested, 260 were injured as hundreds of thousands took to the streets. French officials said they might deploy armored vehicles in Paris for the first time in 50 years if protesters follow through on plans to erect barricades this weekend. Actor and comedian Kevin Hart has stepped down from plans to host the upcoming Academy Awards ceremony following public outcry over his past homophobic tweets and comedy routines. The Academy named Hart host of the Oscars on Wednesday. Less than 24 hours later, Hart was discovered to be rapidly deleting his past anti-gay social media posts amidst a growing uproar, initially refusing to apologize for the comments before offering his resignation from the Oscars ceremony with an apology. In Chicago, over 500 teachers at the Acero Charter School Network have gone on strike, calling for smaller class sizes, more special ed staff, pay equity with Chicago public schools, and protections for undocumented students. It's believed to be the first strike at a U.S. charter school. And today is the 90th birthday of world-renowned linguist and political dissident Noam Chomsky, born in Philadelphia on December 7th, 1928. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The UN Climate Summit is underway in Katowice, Poland, with leaders calling for swift global action. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in his opening remarks climate change is a matter of life and death for many nations, and that the worst polluters are not doing enough to meet the goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. This came just one day after President Trump stood as the sole leader at the G20 summit who did not sign on to his pulling out of the climate accord. While world leaders converge in Poland, the indigenous-led fight against destructive oil pipelines continues across North America. In Louisiana, activists suffered a blow Thursday when a judge ruled that the company building the 163-mile Bayou Bridge pipeline had the right to seize private land for construction under eminent domain. This comes despite the fact the judge ruled that pipeline owner Energy Transfer Partners had trespassed on private land during construction and ordered the company to pay 3 landowners $150 each. The Bayou Bridge pipeline will carry nearly 500,000 barrels of oil per day across Louisiana's wetlands. Meanwhile, incoming New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other lawmakers are calling for a Green New Deal to revolutionize the U.S. economy to combat climate change. Well, earlier this week, I spoke with climate activist Winona LaDuke, Native American activist with the Ojibwe Nation, executive director of the group Honor the Earth. She lives and works in the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. I began by asking her what an indigenous Green New Deal would look like.
Well, indigenous people obviously have a lot of experience with sustainability, a lot of years of it. And so if you look across the country, it turns out that the windiest places in the country are Indian reservations. For those of us who are at Standing Rock, Class 7 wind. You know, one reservation in North Dakota, the Fort Berthold Reservation, has 17,000 times more wind than they could ever use. So you start hooking those tribes up to the grid, which already crosses their land with some bad dam projects. Look at places like the Navajo Nation with 5 coal-fired power plants and 4 coal strip mines. Look at their transition to new solar, for instance, the Kayenta Solar Project, and you've got kind of like a cornerstone. You know, we could call it energy justice, or we could just call it the enlightened economy. You know, really where we need to go. And then you look at the issues of agriculture. I mean, you know, so I come from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, and we have a plan. You know, my plan is, you know, first of all, I'm looking down the barrel of a very big pipeline, which is a $7 billion boondoggle of stranded assets. We'll talk about that later. But I'm looking down the pipeline, you know, at the barrel of this pipeline, and I'm looking, what could $7 billion do in Minnesota? What could it do to make a new Green Deal? So in my territory, for instance, on the Iron Range, there's a new solar plant that has gone in to make solar photovoltaic panels. And on my reservation, we are just beginning, and in February we should be operational, a solar thermal panel manufacturing facility to make solar thermal panels that you can put on the south side of your house and reduce your heating bill by about 20%. We have, you know, solar going in at 20 kilowatts and 200 kilowatt projects. And then we have this larger vision, which, you know, it's not just renewable energy, it's efficiency. And then it's also local foods and the next economy. Our interest in the next economy, I mean, to be honest with you, Amy, I didn't really like this economy too much. Didn't work out too well for my people. You know, so the next economy has to be something that reaffirms our relationship to the earth and gives us a shot. That, to me, looks like a lot of local food, organic food. If you actually went organic in most of your agriculture, and if, for instance, I just read an article, if you ate beans, you know, if we just upped the beans and diminished the cattle, you'd end up with sequestering the carbon in the soil. You know, you don't need some guys to put something in the sky to keep the carbon out of the sky. You need to put it in the soil. And so you need organic agriculture. That's what we're doing in my community. And the other thing that I'm working on is hemp. I have, for 3 years, been growing industrial hemp. And what I'm interested in is the next textile economy. This country in the 1980s and the 1990s offshored all of our textile manufacturing to Asia. And we don't produce anything in this country. And I am a hemp grower. Hemp has 3 times the tensile strength of cotton. Hemp doesn't use all the water, like 5,000 gallons of water for T-shirt and jeans, doesn't use all the chemicals. And in fact, the word canvas comes from cannabis. And so what I want to do is to rebuild the hemp industry in Indian country. And I want us at the table, not on the menu. I want us to be in the leadership of this next economy because we have a lot of territory upon which you can grow hemp, and we can rebuild a light manufacturing industry in this country.
And yet you have a President Trump, who says climate change is a hoax. When it's cold in New England, he says, see, you're talking about global warming?
I'm not going to spend a lot of time rebutting President Trump. I mean, I would spend all day, you know, with that. I mean, to kind of the Native community, he's kind of like the new incarnation of Andrew Jackson. You know, bad president for Indian people, bad president for everybody. But, you know, to us, and, you know, to be super honest, I mean, we don't have a lot of experience with great presidents. You know, what we have experience with is that we're gonna fight this out, and we're going to make the next economy. We're going to make our future. That's what self-determination is about.
So talk about pipeline politics. And for those who aren't familiar with the pipeline you're fighting, give us a map of it. You know, interestingly, I was just interviewing Congressmember-elect Deb Haaland of New Mexico. She's one of 2 Native American women, the first 2, the other Sharice Davids of Kansas, who will be in Congress ever. Yep. Deb Haaland went to the standoff at Standing Rock. Yes. It was a school for so many, even those who are going into electoral politics.
No, that is right. I mean, Standing Rock was an example of, you know, regulatory capture when your whole system is controlled by corporations, and in a state that we call the Deep North. You know, and you experienced the Deep North. And, you know, so we all got a lesson at Standing Rock. We got a pretty good lesson. And, you know, since that time, pipelines have not gone so well, you know, for any of these corporations. So just to give you a context, about a year and a half ago, there were 5 tar sands pipelines proposed out of Canada. Now think of Canada with that pretty guy, Trudeau. You know, they might as well just name that pipeline after him he just bought. I mean, he talks about signing up with Paris, but, you know, Canada is a huge polluter, and if the tar sands come online, that's pretty much game over. But that's what they're trying to do. So to make, you know, to be...
And explain, just to be clear, about when you said that Trudeau bought.
So just to give you this context, about a year and a half ago, there were 5 pipelines proposed out of the tar sands. Tar sands is a landlocked mass of sand that has some oil in it. Super expensive stuff, super, you know, really bad for the environment. One pipeline was called Energy East. That was to go from Alberta to New Brunswick. The second pipeline was called the Northern Gateway. That was to go from Alberta to the Pacific Coast. The third pipeline was called Trans Mountain. Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain, the 4th Keystone, and the 5th pipeline is called Enbridge Line 3. 5 big pipelines to try to get some oil out that's landlocked. So if you look at what's happened, about a year ago, the Energy East pipeline did not get approved by the National Energy Board. Nobody, it turns out, wanted a pipeline crossing Canada. Surprise, surprise. Montreal didn't want it. Nobody wanted it. Second pipeline, Northern Gateway, Enbridge's Northern Gateway, the gem of their Canadian projects, was not approved by the National Energy Board. That leaves 3 pipelines. One pipeline known as the Kinder Morgan, facing massive opposition, not only from First Nations, but by the good citizens of British Columbia, and the Premier of British Columbia opposed, ended up in court because they did not consult with First Nations. The federal court in Canada, the appeals court, revoked all of the permits, nullified all of the permits on Kinder Morgan's pipeline known as the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The same day that that happened, Premier Trudeau purchased that pipeline, hoping, you know, for like $4.9 billion. I think the price tag is now something like $15 billion, so that he would, you know, that Canada would have its own personal pipeline to, you know, cross the territory. You know, I think it's kind of a dodgy investment myself, judging by the courts and judging by the fact that the courts stopped pipelines. Keystone Pipeline, you know, as you know, Trump moved ahead. sprinkled as little fairy dust. That pipeline was stopped again in the federal court in Montana. That should be a year, 2 years, who knows how long, if they are ever able to meet the conditions. Stopped because Trump, it turns out, could not reverse an Obama decision without a reason. You can't just go do it because you want to because you're president.
And Obama finally stopped it after years of mass protests.
Right, years of social movements and lawyers are who stop pipelines. Social movements and lawyers. This leaves one pipeline that is still considered somewhat viable. That pipeline is Enbridge's Line 3. That is a 915,000 barrel a day tar sands pipeline going from Alberta to Superior. And what is very significant about that pipeline, aside from the fact that it's the equivalent of 50 new coal-fired generators coming online, exactly what you do not need in the face of the UN report and the president's own reports on climate change out of the administration. But in addition to that, that feeds into every other pipeline that goes through, for instance, the Straits of Mackinac, the pipeline that is 60 years old. Enbridge's pipeline is a feeder for most of the infrastructure in the northern Great Lakes territory. So that pipeline is what we are fighting. And unfortunately for all of us, the Public Utilities Commission of Minnesota issued a rogue decision in favor of that pipeline. You know, to tell you what I mean by a rogue decision is that, you know, I've been here a few times talking about this pipeline. But, you know, we had 3 years of hearings on this pipeline. 72,000 people came out and testified, of which 69,000 people testified against the pipeline. Equal amount of evidence. The Department of Commerce did not recommend issuing a certificate of need for that pipeline. And in addition to that, the administrative law judge, which reviewed the pipeline for 3 years, recommended against issuing a permit for the route. In June of this year, the Public Utilities Commission of Minnesota disregarded all evidence, disregarded all recommendations by every agency, and issued a permit. And just a couple of days after Thanksgiving, they reaffirmed that permit.
Winona LaDuke, Native American activist with the Ojibwe Nation, executive director of the group Honor the Earth. Back with her in a minute.
Somos la mega ardiendo, somos la rabia y la voz. Hemos venido a cantaros que se acabó la opresión. Somos el eco que rompe toda verticalidad. Siguen soplando los vientos de osadía y libertad. No voy a guardar silencio, no he nacido para callar. Ocupemos los espacios que no quisieron negar. No soy madre por defecto, ni he nacido para esperar. Reconstruyo los cimientos del sistema patriarcal.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our discussion with Winona LaDuke, Ojibwe environmental leader, executive director of the group Honor the Earth. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. I sat down with her earlier this week. So describe your area for us. You know, when you come on to Democracy Now!, we always say you're on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. But describe it for us and where this pipeline is.
You know, where I think about my territory as where the wild things are. Where the wild things are. I have, you know, lynx. I have wolves. I have bears. You know, there are no caribou there now, but there are moose. There are elk. You know, I live in a place where there are still insects. I live in a place where there is still life. And so that place is northern Minnesota, covered by treaty territories, 1855, 54, 37, and 42, full of wild rice, full of lakes, lakes that you can still drink from, lakes that you can still drink from. That's where I live. And that's what this battle is about. It's about, you know, can we protect that? And
when do they say the pipeline will be built?
They've been trying to build it for 3 years. You know, they say that they will begin construction this year. But as I said, you know, we are now entering the appeals process. We are hoping that the state of Minnesota joins us in appealing the decision by the PUC because it was unsupportable, according to the Department of Commerce, legally and in any realm. I mean, the insurance itself, the state approved a $1.4 billion insurance agreement with the Enbridge Corporation. That was based on the Kalamazoo spill, which was a much smaller spill that's not really catastrophic, plus doesn't include the 17,000 miles of pipeline that Enbridge has. You know, and for me, this is part of, you know, what the New Deal is really got to be about. I mean, we are a country that has a D in infrastructure. We have a D in infrastructure. Lawrence, Mass blows up. Bridges crumble. You know, we are probably losing 30% of our gas in aging infrastructure in this country. And so what we need is a new deal that builds infrastructure for people, not for oil companies. As I said, $7 billion that is for, you know, an oil company pipeline, that could be spent much better.
I'm looking at this invoice you brought in regarding climate damages. Explain.
Right. Okay. So we've issued an invoice to the Enbridge Corporation because, you know, in all of their hearings, they talk about, you know, their power plants are going to be, their pumping stations will be powered with solar. Lipstick on a pig. And, you know, they talk about the climate impact of this pipeline is not significant. Well, we have a math team at Honor the Earth, and what we figured out is that the carbon equivalent of what they are carrying, if you had to take that out of the environment, which is what basically we have to do, the trending rate is $1,000 a metric ton. And so the amount of carbon that Enbridge is carrying in, just the carbon itself, is worth $170 billion in expenses annually. The total due, you know, kind of if you're doing some math and aggregating the combined impact of such a badly planned project, is $266 billion annually. And so we have issued an invoice from the creator, you know, Honor the Earth acting on behalf of the creator, to the Enbridge Corporation saying that they should pay this amount. We would prefer to have it early on because according to Moody's, they were downgraded to just above junk bond status in December. And so with the experience that Americans and Native people have of multinational corporations like Enron going bankrupt, we think it would be wise to collect the money in advance.
So you've got line 3 carbon metric ton, then boreal forest.
Yeah, there's a price to destroying boreal forest.
And explain what a boreal forest is.
Tar sands is a boreal forest. You know, and you turn something that is the oxygen of the north. I mean, the boreal forest of northern Canada is the equivalent of the lungs. It's the Amazon of the north. It's the Amazon of the north, and that is what is being destroyed by the tar sands. Wetland, this is, you know, just going through our wetlands, the value of a wetland. You know, I'm an economist by training, but how do you value a wetland for what it does for Mother Earth and for the planet and for your water and for insects and for where the wild things are? You know, but there are some numbers that have been associated with it. We did some math. We multiplied those numbers out. You know, Enbridge's math skills were not ours. And so we've issued this invoice.
And finally, social cost.
You know, I'm not sure how to quantify that, but the perfect example is that, you know, even without a spill, you know, the threat of a spill in a community who relies on wild rice is very traumatic. Having a mega project shoved down your throat causes suicide in Native communities. You know, we already have diabetes and every other epidemic that you do not want to have, and nothing in this pipeline contributes to our well-being. So who's paying for that? Who's paying for that? The state of Minnesota is who made the decision to shove the pipeline down our throats, and so we will fight them. We will fight them.
What does the state and the federal government gain by these pipelines?
You know,
they're private, right?
This is a private pipeline.
Unless it's Trudeau buying Kinder Morgan, right, because Kinder Morgan says they can't afford it anymore.
I mean, to be honest with you, I feel that the state of Minnesota and now the state of Michigan, which is trying to approve a deal to put a tunnel around the pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac, around the pipeline that Enbridge will pay for, but, you know, to just keep the oil going. I feel that the state suffers from the Stockholm Syndrome. You know, they have been told by Enbridge that their pipelines are going to leak. And so if their pipes are going to leak, you need to replace them. And so my position to the state of Minnesota or the state of Michigan would be remove the gun. You know, the Public Utilities Commission said they felt like they had a gun to their head by the Enbridge Corporation, that the pipe was going to leak and so they would need a new pipe. I said, remove the gun. Remove the gun. You're a regulatory agency. You know, you need to get out of the Stockholm Syndrome. And, you know, so there is the representation that there are jobs that will occur, but everybody knows that the 1,200 jobs that will occur over the course of 6 months of building, you know, what they will have a lot more jobs in is the militarization of the North. I mean, in this pipeline's case, the state of Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, when they approved the pipeline, looked to the Enbridge Corporation, a Canadian multinational corporation, and said, will you pay the police? will you pay for the police it will take to install this pipeline? That's what Commissioner Thomas said. And Enbridge said yes. And so, to me, that is a pretty significant crisis in democracy. We know that Standing Rock cost North Dakota $38 million, and they're still trying to recuperate that. And so since you have 300 miles of pipe that no one wants in Minnesota, try to project those costs, Minnesota.
What about insurance?
The insurance of Enbridge. First of all, how do you insure for a big pipeline? I mean, they said it was $1.4 billion to clean up the Kalamazoo spill. The Kalamazoo pipe was
When was that spill?
2010, and the Kalamazoo spill cost $1.4 billion, not necessarily fully cleaned up, but besides that was about 300,000 barrels per day. This pipeline is at 915,000 barrels per day. If they had a worst case, and the $1.4 billion for cleanup of the Kalamazoo spill, which went for 17 hours in not a remote location, was not considered catastrophic by the Enbridge Corporation. So what is a catastrophic spill? If that pipeline breached in Minnesota, the low estimates are $2.4 billion for a catastrophic spill. A spill of the Enbridge Corporation's 50-year-old pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac, well over $6 billion. So to me, one of the questions that I have is that if you are a regulatory agency, why would you approve an insurance guarantee for lower than the price of any potential spill? And in fact, it's not in a kitty, it's in Enbridge's accounts. We would not make the assumption that there would, not be more than one spill on an Enbridge line. There's a spill almost every day, it seems. And so that insurance policy, Enbridge's total insurance policy that they are holding right now in their general insurance is $940 million. And they have 17,000 miles of pipeline. No prudent regulatory agency would have approved an insurance settlement or an insurance agreement like that.
We're broadcasting from Katowice, Poland all week for the UN Climate Summit. These major reports have come out of both the United Nations and President Trump's own administration.
Right.
13 federal agencies, hundreds of scientists, which he poo-poos because he says he doesn't believe in climate change. But these reports that say we are in the end game now. I mean, we just came from California, the fires there that devastated communities.
Yep. I mean, as I look out there, this is the time of, catastrophes of biblical proportions, if we are going to call it that. To the south, you have the great floods. To the west, the entire West Coast is on fire. To the north, the ice is melting and polar bears are eating each other. And to the east, you have a crazy man with orange hair whose, theme song seems to be Talking Heads burning down the house. I mean, I have no idea. That is catastrophe in itself, And so I look out there, as an Indigenous person, our prophecies talk about this time. I can tell you that. I could say, we told you so. For the past, 100 years, we've been saying, in the time of the seventh fire, you're going to have to make a choice between two paths. One well-worn and scorched and the other not. And that is this moment, where we have a choice. And, in my analogy, one time I was sitting in Sitka, Alaska. Did you ever get a chance to go there? Beautiful. Like sometimes you just go someplace. I was at a writer's workshop. I was in Sitka, Alaska, and I was watching, the eagles were capturing the salmon that had come in. And so there was like eagles diving down into the ocean. And the salmon, and there were bears. And I looked out there and I saw this cruise ship coming in to the left of my vision. And it came in and I was like, oh, I don't like that. The cruise ship came in, and then I watched that cruise ship turn a 180 and go exactly back out. And that's basically what we got to do. We have to make the next economy. And that next economy is going to be green. That next economy is going to have people like me making decisions. I'd like to be an architect for the next economy. I didn't like the last one.
Well, you ran for vice president with Ralph Nader.
I did run for vice president. Are you
considering electoral politics again?
Well, I did just apply for an appointed position on the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. The chair has now left, and I have announced I have submitted my application to be on the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. I believe the governor. And in my personal opinion, in my experience, I have a lot of interest in infrastructure and public policy. I've spent a whole life working on it, and I think we should have infrastructure for people. and there should be equitable infrastructure. So, that is my next position that I'm applying for. We will see how it goes.
Who is the governor that will decide?
Well, Waltz may decide. I think, Waltz will probably decide, although Dayton is in. And in Minnesota, what I have to say is that, we also worked to get out the vote. Minnesota had the highest record of voter turnout in a midterm election of any state. And my reservation and my community, we took our bus. We have a bus that says Stop Line 3, and we ran what we called Res Uber. We drove people to town to ride the bus. We drove people to town to vote. And we personally got a lot of people out to vote who never would have voted in this election. I
wanted to go to a different aspect of the building of these pipelines. According to a recent study, police in many U.S. cities failed to track murdered, missing Indigenous women. Can you talk about who they are? When we cover a protest, you'll always see a group of women or Indigenous people and their non-Indigenous allies carrying missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls signs.
Almost every family in my community has one of those women. I have one of those women who was found in the river, in the Mississippi River. It is something that it's not even a PTSD, it's an ongoing stress in a community, because you see what happens. And, there's a number of circumstances. One is that a lot of our people have been made refugees, made refugees by mega projects. So you look at Winnipeg, you got people living in hotel rooms for 5 years, displaced from their northern communities. Across the north, you have that story of displacement, by poverty, but also by mega projects. So people end up like invisible on the edges of cities. So you've got cities like Fargo, North Dakota. You've got cities like Duluth, Minnesota, where homeless Native people represent a significant portion of the population. Of our population. We're not doing well in these cities when we're in the periphery. And so, from those circumstances and from the circumstances of mining camps and man camps, you see a spike in the number of Indigenous women that are kidnapped and murdered. And it is something that, it's prevalent.
At something like 10 times the rate of other women.
Yes.
What are man camps?
Man camps are when they do a mega project, they bring in a bunch of guys. And they stay sometimes in trailers, although Enbridge is trying to put them just in the cities now, in the towns. And with them, there's a whole bunch of drugs, usually. And there's a whole bunch of bad stuff. And then there are these large camps of men. And, in North Dakota, the violence rate spiked significantly. The murder rate spiked significantly.
So what can you do about this?
You can fight mega projects. There's no way to put lipstick on a pig. You can't make a pretty man camp.
When I spoke to you at Standing Rock, you said you're not going to spend your life fighting one pipeline after another. What do you think about that now as we wrap up?
I've spent 5 years fighting Enbridge. I've spent 5 years fighting Enbridge. But to me, the answer is really in what is the infrastructure future of this country? Do we want pipes for people? Flint, Michigan does not have pipes. I have pipes that are sitting in piles in northern Minnesota that we do not want. I say send them to Flint. What we need is a new Green Deal, where Indigenous people are at the front of it, in the middle of it, and determining the future. And that Green Deal will have infrastructure for people in it.
Winona LaDuke, Ojibwe environmental leader, executive director of the group Honor the Earth. This is Democracy Now! Back with Yanis Varoufakis in 30 seconds.
I was tired of being upset. Always wanted something I never could get. Life's an illusion, love's a dream, but I don't know what it is.
Everybody's Happy Nowadays by Buzzcocks co-founder Pete Shelley passed away this week. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we end today's show with the rise of the right in Europe. In Spain, the far-right Vox Party won multiple seats in the regional parliamentary election in Andalusia on Sunday, the first successful election of the far-right in Spain since the country returned to democracy in the 70s after the death of the fascist military dictator Francisco Franco. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon threw his support behind Vox earlier earlier this year and has apparently been advising the far-right party. For more on the rise of the right in Europe, we turn to economist and former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, who's launching a movement with Senator Bernie Sanders and others to fight right-wing forces around the globe. They introduced the movement at a Sanders Institute gathering in Burlington, Vermont last weekend. It's called Progressive International.
Where globalization promised prosperity, it's delivered financial crisis and endless war instead. All the while, our climate moves closer to destruction. Out of this crisis, global authoritarianism is rising. These leaders promise to restore national pride by attacking minorities, a free press, and democracy itself. But in the end, they only serve themselves. A chilling echo of the 1930s. Today's authoritarian leaders do not stand alone. They are part of a global axis of right-wing parties that shares funders, strategy, and contacts. And around the world, they are gaining power. The time has come to form our own common front in the fight for global peace and prosperity. This movement will bring people together across the global left to think about the world we want to live in and how we make it a reality.
Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez and I spoke to Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, on Tuesday. I began by asking him about the significance of the Spanish elections.
Last piece of the jigsaw puzzle that puts together this dystopic postmodern 1930s picture. 2008 was our generation's 1929, and just like after 1929, a monetary system that was not fit for purpose started fragmenting. The hapless establishment, both here in the United States under President Hoover and also in Europe, tried to shift most of the pain onto the shoulders of the weakest of citizens. Discontent followed, and after discontent, of course, and given the left's incapacity to organize, political monsters were ahead. This is exactly what's happening in Europe. The reason why Spain is significant is because when we, as DiEM25 and other progressives, were saying that the last decade was a prolonged early 1930s, prolonged by quantitative easing by central banks that was sort of stabilizing finance without doing anything to change the austerian conditions that were inflicting enormous pain on the middle classes and the working classes. The argument against that was, look at Spain. Spain does not have a far-right neo-fascist movement, unlike Italy, unlike France, unlike Germany. Well, now, out of the blue, in Andalusia, of all places, the stronghold of the Socialist Party, suddenly Vox, a rather nasty piece of work that emerged in 2014, suddenly came from nowhere to repeat the triumphs of the fascists in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, and so on and so forth, therefore completing that awful jigsaw puzzle. So what are we doing? Opposing simultaneously the two faces of authoritarianism. One of the two faces of authoritarianism is the hapless establishment that is trying to pretend, the so-called liberal establishment, which, by the way, is neither liberal nor particularly well established anymore, and they are trying to continue business as usual, like the Weimar Republic was doing in the 1920s. And the other face of the axis of authoritarianism, the fascists and the xenophobes.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because it seems that a common current, whether in Europe or the United States, of this rise of these new neo-fascists is the racialization of immigration as the new threat from the outside to our country, our nation, our patria. And in terms of how a progressive movement deals with how immigration from Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America is being used to divide working people and to foment support for fascism.
Let's be clear on something. Yes, they make a lot of noise about immigration, but immigration was never the issue. Let me give you an example. The loudest noises against the migrant, the foreigner, the refugee, come from places that don't have any, like Hungary. They haven't seen a refugee. They don't know what a refugee looks like. And yet, that is where refugees are demonized more than in Sicily or Lesbos, islands of the Mediterranean, that are swarming with refugees, and the local population is actually extremely solidaristic to them. So it's got nothing to do with flows. Let's get this clear. What it has to do is that with the fact that deflationary forces unleashed by a vicious capitalist crisis, whether it is the 1930s or today, these deflationary forces, especially when they start touching the pension funds, the nest eggs of the middle class, they give rise to wonderful opportunities for advancement, for demagogues, for those who stand on a soapbox and say, I will make you proud again. It is the Jew, the Syrian, the German, the Greek, it doesn't matter, the other, the left-handed person, the different, that, we are going, if we get him, and it's usually him, if we get him, we're going to be free, and our nation is going to be proud again. So let's be clear. This is a symptom. It is not the cause. The cause is a capitalist crisis that was always going to hit us, given the inanity of the so-called growth model of globalization, financialized globalization before 2008, and the incredible cynicism with which that crisis was dealt with or not dealt with by the establishment.
For background, you were the Greek finance minister. People in Greece had enormous hope for the Syriza party to change the situation. People were camping out in the streets, massive protest. You were the main negotiator to bail Greece out. Angela Merkel has just announced she is not going to be running again. You were dealing with her. Talk about that experience and ultimately what led you to resign and what you came to understand. I mean, you were at the height of Greek power.
Oh, not power. Maybe I was in the center of the frame, but I was the finance minister of a bankrupt country. That doesn't make you particularly powerful, Amy, but it makes you it makes you a target, especially the target of the establishment. But you mentioned Angela Merkel being on the way out. I remember that one of the first things I said to my interlocutors in Germany was, look, I recognize and appreciate the fact that you don't like seeing me in the position of the Minister of Finance because I'm a radical left-winger and you would much rather have yet another pushover conservative Greek finance minister. I understand that. I appreciate that. You have my sympathy for this. But let me tell you this, I was saying to them. If you squash us, if you do a coup d'etat, this time they didn't use the tanks as they did in 1967 in Greece, they used the banks. They closed down the banks to asphyxiate the government. What you're going to deal with once you destroy a democratically elected Europeanist progressive left-wing government, you're going to have to deal with right-wing fascists. And lo and behold, Mrs. Merkel is now being booted out effectively because of the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland, because that awful xenophobic fascist party has stolen around 15% of her Christian Democratic power base, and her own Christian Democratic Party is now going to try to appease the fascists by getting rid of Merkel. So that is the first part of the answer. The second one will be much shorter. Well, in this country, you remember how the election of Barack Obama created waves of optimism and hope amongst progressives in this country. And what does he do? He capitulates on day one of his presidency by effectively surrendering to Wall Street, to put it bluntly. The same thing happened with our government. Of course, our government was under enormous pressure that Obama claims he was, but he wasn't really. No comparison with what we were going through. But unfortunately, my comrades, and especially the Prime Minister, surrendered to the Troika. He had a period, an interregnum of a few weeks when he was saying himself that there was a coup d'etat against him, but after that he forgot about it, and now he is competing with other members of the establishment for the prize of being the best servant of the establishment. And this is what happens when the left betrays its grassroots. We should always beware of that.
So what are your hopes in terms of this Progressive International, how it might be able to beat back not only the tide of the rising fascism, but also the increasing insistence on international capital that the only way to move forward is through greater austerity from all countries, from all working class populations?
Our number one priority is to come up with a new deal for the world which is inclusive and which is green, unlike the original New Deal. But the original idea of the New Deal, the original idea of FDR, to energize idle cash and to put it into good use for public purpose, that must be the main priority of the Progressive International, because we live in a world which is awash with cash. We have this amazing paradox, but that's capitalism for you, isn't it? We have the highest level of debts, but also the highest level of savings. The problem is that these savings are not being invested in what humanity needs: good quality jobs, green transition, green energy, green transport. Yeah? So that's what we need to do at a global level. And the way to do this is to answer some basic questions. What kind of monetary system do we want? Because the one we have is broken. What kind of financial system do we want? How do we fund anti-poverty drives across the world, in our countries here in the West, but also a transfer of wealth from the global north to the global south, and the green transition? These are questions that the left and progressives have not answered at a global level. The globalists who gather in Davos, as you said, they know what they want. They want to shift all the pain onto the shoulders of the weakest of citizens around the world. We know what the fascists want. We need to have... And you see, it's not impossible, because it has happened before. If you think of what happened in the Bretton Woods Conference, which was, of course, not a very progressive event, but nevertheless, they gathered, they banned entry to all the bankers. No banker was allowed into the Bretton Woods Conference.
This is Bretton Woods in New Hampshire after World War II.
During World War II, preparing for the post-war era. And for the 20 years of the golden era of capitalism, which was the golden era of capitalism because effectively they put the financial genie into the bottle. Bankers hated that period because they could not do crazy things with your money. So we need to revive the ambition of 1944 and come up with a new deal for the world.
Now, Steve Bannon has popped up in Europe in different places, even with the Vox party wins, the fascist party in Spain. He got involved with them as an early supporter and has established something called the Movement, which aims to expand the far right throughout Europe. Can you talk about whether this is significant or not, and also what your group, DM 2025, is?
Well, M stands for movement, so we were there first. But the difference is that Steve Bannon's movement has a purpose of reaping a harvest of anger, using that anger in order to weaponize a far-right hatred-based agenda, in order to maximize the power of strongmen like Salvini, like Kurz, like Seehofer, like the Vox people that you mentioned, and just like Mussolini and their ilk in the 1930s, to turn it against the people whose anger they have harnessed. Whereas our narrative is one of unity, one of solidarity between different peoples, solidarity with the migrants, with the refugees. To answer an earlier question which I did not answer fully, our reaction to the arguments that we are being swamped by foreigners and so on is let them in. Borders are a scar on the surface of the planet, on the face of the earth. They make no sense. The only thing that they do is they increase the profits of the traffickers. And at the same time, we are failing to understand that Europe is aging. We need migrants. We need refugees. So, in other words, you cannot compete with the fascists, with fascism light. Like Hillary Clinton the other day, stupidly, and I use that word with a great deal of thought, suggested that the way to defeat populism in Europe is to erect borders around Europe and to stop migrants from coming in. Hillary Clinton said that, proving that she was unfit to be president of the United States yet again. You cannot compete with them playing their own misanthropic game. The only way you can compete with them is by appealing to the humanity of humans and also to their rationality. And using migrants as a football, in the end, backfires. So we are going to fight them on the beaches, and when I say them, I mean the fascists. I mean those that Steve Bannon is organizing. They are going to face up to the fact that we're going to be there and we're going to be undermining their movement with arguments that appeal to rationality and to humanity.
On the issue of trade, obviously the Brexit issue is a big issue in Europe. Here in the United States, Trump keeps railing against all the unfair trade deals that China is unfairly exploiting trade for its benefit with the United States. How would the Progressive International deal with this whole continuing conflict over trade policies in the advanced industrial countries?
We oppose both globalism and nationalism. Using internationalism, what does that mean? Beyond the slogan aspect of it. Well, it means that the idea that you simply eradicate borders for goods and capital, but not for human beings, and everything's going to go well, it hasn't worked. It has transported parts of the third world into the West, with whole communities that have been devastated through deindustrialization in Europe as well as in the United States. And at the same time, it has created massive depredation and exploitation in the third world, in developing countries, except China, which is using a particular industrial model that somebody like Trump does not like. The solution is not tariffs. The solution is not to stop trade. The solution is to impose minimum living wages in the countries that want to trade with you.
We're headed to Poland to cover the UN Climate Summit. It's the third time Poland will host this, which is very interesting, considering it really is coal land, and we're going to the heart of coal land right now. We'll be going to Katowice. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the government of Poland? President Duda, he just recently met with Trump, and where Poland is going right now?
Poland is very much like Hungary. It's a place that has experienced humiliation and devastation in the 90s during the transition from communism to capitalism. An experience of decades under a Soviet regime makes it easier for a new regime to come that is as authoritarian as the previous regime. Now, this regime that you're going to be visiting now, or that is ruling the country that you're going to be visiting in the next few weeks or days, it is a very interesting regime because, on the one hand, they have done something that has not happened in the West of Europe. They have shunned austerity in the sense of increasing pensions and increasing minimum benefits for the poor. But at the same time, they've done this in a paternalistic, neo-fascistic, xenophobic way, which is not new at all. Because if you think about Benito Mussolini in the 1920s and 1930s, he introduced the first public pension fund system in the world, universal. And he did look after the working class on the basis of a social contract. We will increase your living standards, we will protect you, but you will have to forfeit all your democratic rights, all your trades unions rights. You will belong to me, the Duce, and you will belong to your employer, who is my main funder, the Fiat factories and so on. That was a deal. Now, if you look at the attitude of this Polish government, is patriarchal, misogynist, xenophobic, looks after workers and families by lifting minimum wages and minimum pensions, and at the same time demands complete allegiance and loss of democratic rights from the population. We do have a postmodern 1930s.
Former Greek finance minister, economist Yanis Varoufakis, speaking this week after attending the Sanders Institute gathering in Burlington, Vermont, where he, Senator Sanders, and others launched the Progressive International. To see a video, audio, podcast transcript of the show, you can go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Katowice, Poland, all next week. Tune in. Democracy Now! Has an immediate job opening for a full-time social media manager here in New York City. Resumes are being reviewed as received, so apply online today. Details at democracynow.org. A very happy birthday to Carla Wills and Igor Moreno. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warren, Afsem Alkoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Libby Raines. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much.